Greetings and welcome to Rite Designs, episode number 2. Um, I'm not talking about Rite publishing stuff today. I'm just talking about adventure design. I really just want to talk about adventures in general. It's been something we've been working on at Rite Publishing from the long walk to my own No Be So Fierce for uh, dice list to a pitch I have been talking to a freelancer about a space time matrix uh, dismantled MacGuffin kind of adventure. I'll come back to that later on what I'm talking about there because it's a good example of what I think is good game design. Um, Also, I've been nominated for an Emmy just for my adventure design alone for To Kill or Not to Kill when I worked on Arcana Evolved stuff for Monty Cook's Arcana Evolved. We do a lot of adventures for Adventure Quarterly, each and every month. Well, I'm sorry. Every quarter we put out 3 adventures, so an adventure every month basically. But we put it all in one bundled package for you, and we're getting ready to launch um, Adventure Quarterly number 5 over at Roll20.net. So there's a virtual tabletop there. We have a really awesome adventure with the Breaking of Fostar Nagar from Ben McFarlane already over there at Roll20. So this is a great expansion of that with some great tokens by Devin Knight. But getting back to off of the shill, let's just talk a little bit about adventures. Um, Adventures get people to play the game, and a lot of people talk to me. There's the common wisdom is that adventures don't sell because uh, there's too many GMs out there, but I don't buy that because GMs are the people who buy most of the stuff. Now, what you have to overcome is, is it worth you? Is your adventure customizable? Because nobody's going to run your adventure as written most often. They're going to make their own custom changes. Even the best adventures that I've written, I've played from Paizo. I've made changes on the fly. I'm a big improv game master. It's kind of like the old adage: no battle plan survives the first arrow. Well, no adventure survives its first contact with the PCs or the GM, for that matter. Sometimes. To give an example of why I think you can overcome that um, idea is you just look at the Paizo Adventure Pass. It's one of their most popular lines. It's what drove their game system, and I think that's part of what can really make it happen. Is I think you need to have not just standalone adventures, which are nice, but I think you need to have that kind of continuing story. It's great if they can be used as standalone and to have a sidebar about how to run it as a standalone adventure, but I really think you need a continuing story to really engage people, even if you're just getting people who want to come in and read your adventures. Remember, a lot of the RPG hobby is collectors and readers, not just people who play. So there's a talk about that. But let's talk about, let's get away from the marketing aspects and talk about why I like designing adventures. And uh, for one, let's say that you design all your own stuff. Why should I buy a published adventure? Well, it's time saver. For one, it's easier to go in and customize an existing adventure that's already written out for you and is already pre-planned and has everything available for you. I think that's the first benefit for GMs. One, you get they're loot boxes. You go in and you loot what you want out of them. You don't necessarily have to take them. Whether it's maps, whether it's NPC pictures, not even just I'm not even talking about just the NPC stat blocks, but the artwork in and of itself is a great thing. It's always better to show than to tell. So just showing your players a picture makes a huge impact. One of the things I'm doing with No Beast So Fierce is I actually took the artwork and I'm designing the adventure around the artwork I have, and then once I get done, I'll work with Tommy Salama to do a map for it. But because I think that's something that has to come afterward, but we'll talk about cartography a little later. Oh, and also, there's another great set of adventures that we've done that's Kaiden, which really comes from a cartographer wanting to do a to play around with this campaign setting, and adventures really help you define your campaign setting. I always say that you should always do a three thing adventure arc before you do your campaign setting, because it enables to introduce people to that setting. That's just my opinion. Um, there's so much that I really like about adventure design. Uh, there's things I don't like about it as well, but we'll get to that here in a few. When you're talking about adventure design as a GM who doesn't use pre-written adventures, again, there's just a whole lot you can loop from them. And besides maps, besides artwork, you can just, traps, just encounter scenarios. You don't necessarily have to take an adventure in its entirety. You might find just one dungeon room. There might be some great ideas in it that you want to use, and you can string them all together or place them throughout. There are wilderness encounters that you may find really interesting or just inspirational to get you to move on. Um, I think one of my favorite scenarios recently was the idea of a Godzilla style monster, and rather than doing it with something like a Godzilla, Pathfinder did it with a gigantic owlbear. You can do with these. That's just a great scenario to add into any game. It's just some odd monster that you normally wouldn't consider to be that threatening, and just make it ridiculously huge and let it tromp around in your thing. Uh, Another one that I found once that I've used a couple times and I just think is awesome was Drow War Book 3. It has this really awesome scenario where you have a Tarask, basically a Godzilla style monster, that's never been injured until recently for the very first time in millennia, and it acts like an injured puppy dog rather than a rampaging Godzilla monster. It's just hungry, it wants to feed, it wants to be left alone, and if you injure it, rather than attack you and get angry, it gets scared and runs off, rampaging more through, rather than going all Hulk. It runs away, but something that huge running away causes a lot of damage. It was a really interesting scenario. Those types of things can be inspirational to you as a GM, and that's what gets me excited about any adventure that I'm going to sit down and read. Um, uh, Probably the biggest mistake I see adventure designers make, and this comes, Wolfgang Barr's talked about this a couple times, is just useless backstory. They want to set the stage, which is great, but I always, Ben McFarlane, who's a, Annie award-winning adventure designer, talks about concise writing a lot being the biggest thing that most game designers really need to get down, and that's one of the things that I'm about when it comes to backstory. You need to file it down to the most basic story that you can for the pitch, and keep your backstory minimum. And also, when you're talking about backstory, there has to be a way for, the backstory can't be just the GM's information. There has to be a way to convey that information in the adventure. And if you can't do that, then apparently it's not important for the adventure, and the information shouldn't be in there. Even if it's a secret and it hinges on the climax of the adventure, at the climax you should be revealing that information somehow, or right after the climax, so that players get an idea of what the whole story is and they can put the pieces together. There's a great way to do that called the jigsaw puzzle piece plot, where you can give out little bits of information so that you're not flooding people with huge amounts of exposition for your players. Player handouts are really great for that. Players love handouts, so having there's a great tool in video game design where you have somebody who has amnesia, and you start dropping bits of a diary around so that you can get the idea of what's going on in people's heads, and bits and pieces like that kind of spell out what's going on. There was nothing wrong with, it's a really awesome piece if you want to stick the exposition in as the villain's diary that you find at your climax. So again, it's not some horrible useless piece of story that you never get use out of with the backstory. There's just numbers and numbers of ways that you can go along with that idea and create a really great scenario that doles out your backstory rather than it being entirely useless. Um, that's just one of the many thoughts that I've had about how to dole out backstory so that it's never useless. You know, in Pathfinder, you can easily make it a a lore check. You know, just a knowledge check or a gather information check to learn some of that information. You know, you can make it early on in the adventure. So you know, if it's secret information, then make the DC uh, extremely high. But you know, sometimes it can be interesting if you reveal the secret at the beginning. Um, you know, I just you can have really good luck and have really amazing success. You know, don't be afraid to put it out there and have that kind of, you know, wow, that would spoil the adventure. Sometimes it's good to spoil the adventure. Sometimes if you spoil it in such a way that, you know, if you're really worried about spoiling it, don't just say it out loud. You know, hand it as a secret note and let that player, you know you'd like to keep it a secret so it doesn't spoil the entire adventure. But it's great for them because they get to see behind the scenes. Um, that kind of stuff is really interesting. I really love that when you're doing adventures and you're writing them. Um, those are two some of the big things. Summaries of adventures, you know, those are really good too. Even if you're not somebody who's going to straight out use an adventure, you know, you can just get plot ideas. You know, just take every adventure summary that you want. There's a great tool out there uh, that does the best uh, RPG plots. That's basically somebody having gone through all of the Ross went through all of the dungeon magazines and looked at all the basic adventure plots. I think there's 36 somewhere close to there. I'd have to go back and look at it again. It's been a while since I've looked at it, but that's the kind of stuff that you're really looking at. You know, Engine Publishing has a great thing. I think it's like 501 great RPG plots. That's another great tool that I've used. Which you know, those summaries can be ideas that you kickstart. So you know, even like I said, a reference. If somebody comes up with a player background that comes close to that, it's an instant hook that you can use to bring them in. It's another thing that adventurers really need when you're doing written adventures. You really need to think in the idea of hooks, and I used to do like 9 hooks per adventure that used to be based on the idea of alignment, but I really just kind of brought it back to agendas. Especially if you're doing one that works in a campaign setting, it's great because you can use organizations and so forth. When I was doing Questhaven, the campaign setting, I really thought that the campaign setting was going to be about adventurers and what's going to motivate them to get together, cooperate, and move on. And we had an adventurers guild that organized everybody. You know, the same way that Pathfinder Society organizes people to go on adventures. But this idea being that they're the nobility of the kingdom. You know, the adventurers rule the land, so you know it makes them have to engage as adventuring companies in, you know, the basic problems of the realm, whether it's political, whether it's military, whether it's social problems. It's really your problem because it's your land. Kingmaker does a great job with that too by making, you know, let the players start out in a very wowish type of environment where they're just exploring and gaining control of the land and so forth. Lord of Gospel and Shadow, when I look at it a lot of times as a designer, now again, I really think the Kindred is the best person to talk about adventuring, and Jason Durrell, the guy who created the setting. But one of the things I look at it, because when I'm doing that, I don't want to tell stories that reflect Amber Diceless role playing. I want to show what you can do with the Lords of Godsmar and Shadow. And one of the big things for me is a much more cooperative game. So I tend to, when I look at my writing for No Be So Fierce, I wanted to create a very cooperative story. And I wanted to come back down to, you know, there's huge big picture things when you're doing something as powerful as Lords of Godsmar and Shadow. But when I wanted to do No Be So Fierce, I wanted to come back down and tell a microcosm story. And you can do stuff like that with adventures, which I really love. You can tell big epic scale stories, or you can tell the story of a little girl with a lost puppy, you know, that you're trying to help. You know, and all the things that can go wrong there. Um, that kind of stuff can be entertaining. And in this case, I wanted to tell a story about that was more that stepped away from the medieval urban fantasy and did more of a sci-fi urban fantasy with what I'm doing with No Beast So Fierce. Again, you can do interesting genres. Know your audience is a big thing about knowing what adventure you want to create. I wanted to create something new and interesting that could be weaved into any existing game. So I expect I'm going to eventually look at making it a multi point system. Where you have different levels of play. Whether you want to do something really exalted, whether you want to do something kind of middle of the road, or you want to do something that's just starting out. I'm thinking that three is the benefit for Lords of Gossamer Shadow with dice is the stat blocks are not all that big. It's really story that impacts the play. So being able to do it with multiple points, but yet how do you bring a exalted level style game of 500 points or 1,000 points or something ridiculous like that down to the level of 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 a micro level, since that's this kind of story I'm telling. And I really think about it. Just because you're big, huge, and powerful doesn't change your relationships with peoples. It doesn't change your agendas. It doesn't change your friendships. Sometimes those bonds can be even closer because there's so few people you can trust as you get more powerful. Those types of things I really look at, and that's one thing that I really try to get people to think about. A lot of people think in black and whites with agendas, good versus evil. That's easy and simplistic. But I like to try to take a step back and remember that you want complex character motivations. And I also like sometimes to throw in to my adventures things that are contradictory because, living human beings, sentient beings, whatever you want to say for whatever game you're playing, are paradoxes. They aren't just one thing. They aren't two-dimensional characters. They have, things they care about, things they despise. They have a history that can interpret that. Not every character has to be that incredibly in-depth, but your main character should be. You want them to be well-rounded enough so that a GM can make decisions for them that go outside the confines of what you're writing. I always say that when you're GMing, your outline is your final draft because you're going to do most of it improv. But there are those people who want completely spelled out in a very railroad style. But one of my big things about adventure design is I really, really like sandboxes, and it's something we're working on with Lords of Gossamer Shadow. It's something I'm working on with my articles that I'm writing for Adventure Quarterly. It's my big sandbox is Quest Haven when it comes to Pathfinder. It's something that I'm really working on. Talking about Lords of Gossamer Shadow, we talked a little bit about a time matrix space adventure, and this is what it's really a toolbox for how to run an adventure that's really interesting. This really came up from the idea of a dismantled MacGuffin, if you will, a rod of 7 parts, collecting all the pieces to the super weapon, and putting them together, that kind of stuff. In this case, I talked a little bit about the idea. I really wanted to use a real world kind of scenario because it's one of the benefits of Lords of Gossamer Shadow. And we talked about secret sharing, which is the idea that, let's just say, for example, you have a password, and you don't trust everybody around you, but you're the king, or you're Vala, you're the High Lord, you're the Lady of the Shining Veil, the leader of the Gossamer Lords, and you have a specific password that you want to keep hidden, but you don't want to trust that if you get killed or something, I always talk about these things called, I got hit by a bus file, something killed me, and something could happen. She might take the secrets and pass them out to, say, 3 or 5 of her, or the rest of the Gossamer Lords, and give pieces of this password. And you may not need all the pieces to figure out what the password is, but you need at least some of them to figure it out. So not just one or two of your people can ally against you and kind of take over your system. So this kind of idea is, so let's say something accidentally happens and you need to gather, and you as the group of PCs need this to perform a particular task. Saving the universe, saving a particular world, just saving your own personal domain, saving, the city that your family is in on Earth. It doesn't have to be world shattering. It can be. It's gonna just. It's gonna. If we don't do this, you're going to have the big bad, the Dwemer Lake, invade a particular part of the stair and really take over that area, or sever part of the stair and leave all these worlds to spin off into shadow, erasing them from existence. You can do that type of big stuff, or it can just be saving a small city. But you need this piece, and so you keep it simple, and each one, you have to travel to where each of these particular Gossamer agents or Gossamer lords are, along the grand stair or through particular doorways, and the travel time in and of itself, and going to each one of these and the adventures you get. The journey's the thing a lot of times. So that's the basic idea for the space. Time, you can put a time limit on. If you want to push the players along, you can put a time limit on it. They have to do it in X amount of time, or things start to go bad. And you don't necessarily have to end it. Like nothing can possibly go right. It's just that you start putting time points, event markers along this line. If they don't get it within X number of days, Y happens. If they don't get it in a number of days, B happens. These types of things that you continue along on a progression to give, things go from bad to worse to, oh my God, we could let Godzilla out and it couldn't get any worse. Releasing an Anunnaki against the Dwemer Lake and all of us is not necessarily a bad idea at this point. These are the types of things you can progress to with that. And then you come to, so you've got this nice sandbox effect going on. You've got all these worlds that you can go to. You've got this travel effect. Nothing stops them from going anywhere, creating their own solutions. All you're doing is setting up the scenario and letting the players solve it, rather than you having a particular railroad for them to go along. There are scenarios. If they don't decide to follow the adventure, these things happen. You encourage them. You hope that you do. That will come back to hooks, and that's where those come from, and how to create effective ones. These types of, and I'll probably just do that entirely on a whole other segment about adventure design. Creating effective hooks is probably one of the biggest things you can possibly do, because it can make or break a GM's adventure by having obstinate players who just don't want to play, don't want to go along. They want to be contrary. So how do you get them? I can tell you a couple ways, but we'll come back to that. But space, time, how do you make it a matrix? How do you make it even crazier? Well, each one of these, our Gossamer lords, has an adventure. Maybe Battissimo wants, the Empire Maker wants to be king. He wants to be the new lord of all the Gossamer lords with the Vala out of the way. He decides to gather up all these keys himself. Lucian is lost in his library, and you need to go find him. And he wants these things. Maybe he wants these things kept secret. He doesn't want that somebody to have access to Vala's records, regardless of who it is. Maybe you're dealing with Drake, who wants to make sure that only the right person in his mind has access to these things, and he decides that Battissimo and Lucian just can't be trusted, and that they're, once we have their secrets, they need to be eliminated. I'm saying these as extremes examples, but every one of these types of NPCs has his own agenda, and can work. And you should think about how they create, how you create conflict in the adventure. Remember, ultimately, an adventure is about the players. It's about the GM, because you want to make it easy for him to use, but the ultimate is to create a play experience that the GM is running. and gives him a lot of narrative advice of where they can go with the story and what potential pitfalls uh, can happen. And again, if you give them, a good setting with a lot of well-rounded PCs, and you talk about what the ultimate goal is and what happens, you've got great location encounters, you've got great event encounters from your timeline, and you've got great NPCs. I think that really rounds it out, and you can bring your players into that scenario. You know, you can make it, you can step away from the cooperative adventure with Lords of Gossamer Shadow. Let's say you want to do an Amber style game, just make the secrets amongst the PCs. Give each one of them a little piece, and they have their own agendas of trying to acquire them all, putting them all together. This is just a basic scenario of what you can do. And that's an adventure we're probably going to write up and do. I'm not saying they're all going to be used, all the big Gossamer rewards from it, because I like to keep. I'm a big status quo kind of guy, and I like to flesh out the universe. So we might use agents of theirs that we haven't really fleshed out. But I'd like to bring them in and touch on what each one of them is going to do. I think Battissimo would be a great substitute for Vala in this case, where Battissimo is the one who handed out the secrets to his Imperadors, his underlings that are handing out, and the PCs can be involved with Battissimo's empire that way, and how they're going to interact with each other. That's the kind of stuff that I really look forward to. Adventure design, I just really love it. Those are the types of things I love playing in sandboxes. I get excited about them. So we talk about that. So I've avoided talking just about a lot of things. So let's get back to one of the things that I do enjoy talking about is publishing adventures. We've talked about how GMs can, even if you're not using published adventures, how you can loot them. And just an example, we go back to the big scenario. There's a framework for you to use to create an adventure. Each one of those NPCs can have a personal tie to one of your PCs. That creates a great way to tie your PCs into that. What if each one of these NPCs who you need to get the secret from are all relatives? What if they're all mentors? What if they're, or mix and match, all that kind of ideas? What if they are your rival in the game? Those are the types of scenarios you can run. You can create some really interesting encounters beyond, these types of frameworks. The events that come through there. A timeline event could be used for any setting. Timelines events are great because they're usually not subject to location, and they can happen, any particular time. You just change the time that they occur. So they become great improv pieces that you can add to any game. But one of the big things is we just talk about time sinks. Creating and writing your own adventure is a lot of time, and you can save a lot of time by running a pre-written adventure. You can save a lot of time by looting them, and creating your own toolbox from your collection of adventures. All of these encounters, all of that. It's one of the things that Kit and I talked a lot about when we were talking about the long walk, is we wanted to make it not just an adventure, but a GM's toolbox for creating adventures. So let's get back to the publishing aspect of that, and talk about what Rite Publishing and what we've talked about a bit about the common wisdom, but I tend to reject that because I've seen, take a look at Necromancer games / Frog God games, and look how successful they are doing adventures. I mean, that's primarily what they focus on, is just writing adventures and bringing in people to buy adventures. That's what their company is built on, and I really want to get more adventures out for Lords of Gossamer Shadow. It's why I'm such a big proponent of Adventure Quarterly, is I believe in adventures. So that's something I wanted to bring around. you're going to see something interesting here where we start seeing product supports for some of those products we've done that get supported by adventures that encourage people to play with them so you can really expand on it. Uh, but one of the things we talk a lot of times is what do you charge for an adventure as a publisher? We're going to talk a little bit about writing adventures in here. Um, Remember that when you're talking about an adventure as a publisher and even as a GM, um, you're talking about um, putting together cartography, you're talking about writing, you're talking about artwork if you're talking about a published adventure, you're talking about um, layout. There's just so much that you're talking about. Are you going to do a full color book? Well, that artwork's going to cost you more. That map is going to cost you more than a black and white one would. Um, you know, it was a big change for Adventure Quarterly to go from stock art and computer generated maps to fully customized art and custom hand drawn maps. That was a huge leap for us, and that we still publish each and every quarter in full color. We put out 4 a year. That's kind of our goal. Each subscription is 4 issues, so even if we don't get it in the year, you're still going to get your 4 issues for your money's worth. We do a lot with our game design. With that, we're doing, we're still going to, Lords of Gotham and Shadow pretty much set its standard is that we're going to do full color products. That's an expense. So how do you look at that? You have to figure out how are you going to overcome those costs and make those interesting. As a GM, if you're creating your own adventure, that's easy. You can use DeviantArt. I always talk about the idea that you want to find artwork that nobody else has used. You don't want to find stuff. Just search through. Do a Google search for the type of image that you want, and just type in site:"deviantart.com, and it'll search through and show you all these great pieces of artwork that maybe you've never seen, and hopefully your players have never seen. So you can use those to display artwork. There's plenty of free maps out there. You can go to the Cartographers Guild and find those if you're using it just for your home game. We're talking about GMs just using it for your home game. Again, eluding stuff to create your adventures with. But I'm also, I talk about publishing, but as a GM, you're creating an adventure. You're just close to publishing. You're just not going for a professional route. You're not following the exact format. You can improv a lot more. You can keep a lot in your head and not necessarily have to write it down. But those types of things, there's a reason why they carry over. Handouts are much easier to create. Custom, you can just print them out. Use all kinds of fonts, whether you use GIMP or whether you use Adobe Acrobat, Illustrator or something like that. There's lots of tools out there. There's lots of parchment paper and so forth about how you can create interesting handouts. I once upon a time used to take a pan and create lay out little tea bags in them and just soak my paper in them and then let them dry out so it'd have that old crinkly paper kind of feel if I was doing a particular handout. Those types of things can take a little time, but if you have a crafty person, if you have a friend who's really crafty and likes doing craft stuff like that, you can get them to help you if it's not necessarily you. Your significant other might be a crafty person while you're a game design type of person, that they can really help you out with that. But let's say you're doing, pardon me, a professional adventure. What are you going to charge for that? There's common wisdom. You can go look at basic and do comparative analysis as to what does Paizo charge for an adventure. What is WotC going to charge for the 5th edition adventures from Kobold Press? What's Necromancer Games? I'm sorry, Frog God Games charging for its adventures. There's a successful company that sells its adventures. What is it charging for them? You can look at those type. What does Kobold Press charge for its adventures? Kickstarter makes a big difference on that kind of stuff, especially if you're a new company. It's something I think would be more interesting if you really could find a great adventure writer and pitch a particular adventure. I think Lost Lands was pitched as a Kickstarter. Do if you have a huge idea for a huge adventure, you can do it as like what Frog Out Games did, to give you another adventure of a great one, where they do it in series. Look at an adventure path. An adventure path is done by Paizo usually in 6 parts. If you go back and look at the dungeon adventures, there were huge numbers done of adventure paths more often than single pieces. Monty Cook's Dungeon a Day was done, piecemeal, a room a day. There's nothing that says you couldn't do a wilderness adventure. There was an idea a little while back about a Gossamer World a Day. We do little PDFs with Matt Bannock of these little worlds, and just a world hopping little adventure that could go through all of these, just little pieces, as you explore them. Think of it as a hex crawl adventure sometimes, or think of it in a word balloon, or connecting an idea balloons. Just little connectors. Those types of ideas. So what are you going to charge for something like that? You can do estimating or approximating based on what people do at page count. There's ways to look at that. If you do a 32-page adventure, black and white, it would normally charge at retail for $9.99. But if you make it color, that's $5 more. There's a $14.99 adventure for you. That's just to give you, that's print. That's to give you a baseline. The general wisdom is that you should charge half that for a PDF. So, there's significant savings versus getting the electronic version versus getting the print version. And there's a lot less overhead when you're doing electronic copies. So, you're still making the same amount of money in general. So, there's $7.49 for you if you have a 32-page full color adventure. You can go cheaper than that. You can go. I don't recommend going more than that, just because I'm a crazy guy like that. Ultimately, you want. You don't want to lose revenue by raising prices. You want to charge. You want to get close to the point where you would lose. You want to get right to the edge of where you would lose a customer but still make money. But I just want it to be affordable to where it's a good value. Ultimately, you've got 6 people. 5 maybe. Let's say you have 4 players and 1 GM. There's 5 people making that product, using that product. You think of the GM using it, but each one of the players is getting a benefit from that. So there's a lot of value in an adventure over a particular product. That's the kind of stuff I look at when I think of adventures. But we'll come back to more another day about charging stuff and what price points are in and things. It's not an exciting thing, but it's something to think about, because you got to cover all those expenses, that kind of stuff. I can remember I did it as gifts one time for my players, where I had artists draw character images of each one of the PCs, as Christmas gifts. Think about what if you're willing to pay $25 for a black and white image, or say $50 to $60 for a color image. Talk to what people charge for private commissions and so forth and so on. I'm well known for finding new and upcoming artists because I'm a small company. I have been lucky in finding good talent. But those are the types of things that we work for. Who's going to buy it? Who's going to buy your product? Of course, I want every GM of Lords of Gossamer and Shadow to buy The Long Walk. Everyone who's a Kickstarter backer of the $30 level or higher will get a copy of that. So, the PDF, and then they'll get the print on demand copy at cost. But, I'm going to sell it. So, let's say The Long Walk, let's say it ends up being 60 pages. We'll take a look at, who do I want to buy it beyond that? I'm selling it to GMs as not just an adventure, but a toolbox, and it's a toolbox that you can loot. Even the adventure you can loot to use to give you ideas of what kind of adventures. It's one of the big things. We have an adventure in the back of Lords of Gossamer Shadow, Gathering Storm. It's a good thing to look at. It's we get talked a lot of times about using it as a playtest. Um, that kind of scenario is what you're looking for. Um, but you're really thinking about it as a GM. If you're not talking about a published adventure, who's going to buy it, that's your audience. It's your players. You have to market your game to them. I know it seems weird to think about that way, but focus on them. Get focused. Think of it as a real niche. This is your niche product for your players. Does one guy love puzzles? Does another guy love breaking stuff? Does another guy want to talk to everything? Does another guy love political puzzles? He wants to figure out what every NPC motivation is, who that person is. Is he a lore guy? Does he want to write down every bit of information and really figure out what's going on? You're going to write and cater to that, and customize it when you're doing that. And that's, I like to say, how does this address each one of the basic types? And you can put that in a little sidebar if you're a professional adventurer. How does it address the guy who is an action-oriented escapist, a hack and slasher, if you will? How does it address the consummate role player, the talkie RPer, who, if it's not talking to them, it wants to know why, and it's asking it and sad until it gets talked to it. If it's not talking to it, it talks some more. How do you deal with the problem solver? He wants to figure out how everything works. He wants to look behind the scenery of your campaign, and probably is maybe a GM and should be running his own game. Your sidebars can address those, and you should think about that. Each player you have, what type of game does he enjoy? And you can, the big, huge benefit as a GM is that you can ask them directly what they want, and you can, you'll make a better adventure than anybody else does. But again, you can loot from professional adventurers to make that easier for you. And the internet is a great thing for that. If you have a particular scenario you're working on, you can just ask somebody on your social media feed or on a message board. I'm looking for an adventure that does this, and you'll get 50 people telling you what they do, and then you can go read the reviews to figure out what you want to, if you want to do it, and loot from it. And that's one of the things why we're talking about it, Pathfinder. So there's a huge thing of those out there. When we're talking about Lords of Gossamer Shadow, there's not much, and that's one of the things I want to correct, is create more adventures, and why we have 2 in the works right now and a 3rd in development that I've been talking to, and why we're going to bring in an adventure line developer that we'll be talking about tomorrow. That kind of stuff, and bringing in more professional writers, people who have, whose job is just to write an adventure and be done with it. And get more out there for you, so that it gives you more to work with. And I also think it gives you a shared dialogue when you have stories to talk about with other players. Have you played this? What did you do when you came to this scenario? That kind of stuff can be a real fun thing to do afterwards. That, again, that's audience. It's just one of those things that also, when you think about professional design, you want to think about what level of GM you're working with. Whether it's an advanced adventure where you expect them to have, even if it's just what products you expect them to own. Do you expect them just to have the core book? Do you expect them to have every scenario out there? Do you expect power gamers? Do you expect RPers? Do you have a focus niche? Tell people up front. Your maps, how are you going to do those? Are you just going to use existing maps as a GM, or are you going to use, go hunt down some ideas? Again, I'm the kind of guy who likes to write backwards. I like to find good pieces of artwork, good maps, and write the adventure. Sometimes I've seen professional game designers who just draw the map and then create an adventure based around the map. Those types of things. When we're talking about professional adventures, I like to do an image every 4 pages. I think Atlas Games does one every 5. You know, we're talking about Pathfinder. You're talking one every other. Some you know, sometimes I can, you know, with good stock art and good Creative Commons art, I can do one every page. Um, but you know, understand art costs, and don't be afraid if you're doing art costs on a budget. Don't be afraid to just tell somebody what your budget is. I've done things where I put it up on our website. Look, we're looking for this, and this is how much we can pay for it, and I'll get 15 artists. Now there might be a lot of wheat, and you know, and you might have, you know, you're going to have to to panhandle through till you find the gold nuggets, you know. But you know, that's the type of things, you know, until you find the diamonds in the rough. But you're going to find them that way. Um, you know, I started out with a budget where, you know, we could pay $30 for an image, and that's all we could pay. We've increased that steadily over time to where we don't pay just, you know, just $30 for one image. You know, for I'm talking full color here too. That we were doing head and torso shots for just $30, and you know, I think now we pay for a torso shot like that. We've paid $60 for, so it's been an increase in our, you know, I paid higher, you know. I think the most we ever paid for a cover when we were first starting out was $100. I think we've gone as high as $250 for a cover. You know, people don't like me talking about uh, how much somebody makes, but you know, I want to pay more. You know, the more money I make, the more I can afford to pay people. Kickstarter's made a huge impact on that, on what you can afford to pay for. Um, So, but think about that. You know, you can find some great artwork out there. You know, if you want to put it up on your website, you can look through Creative Commons stuff, stock art, um, and license it. You know, the Creative Commons has a lot of good stuff out there. Google allows you to search for it. You can, you know, a lot of times Wikipedia has a lot of open public domain artwork that you can use. You know, there's a lot of great public domain artists out there that, you know, died before 1923. Or published their stuff in books before 1923 in the U.S., and you can use a lot of that artwork. I always try to still give people credit for that, but you don't have to. You know, if it's public domain with Creative Commons, you're required to, and you should, and include the licensing information. But yeah, you can have a lot of fun with that, and not get, you know, and do the right thing. It's like I say. Um, so that's a lot of the marketing of and publishing of adventures, and just my general thoughts of them. I don't like to pontificate too much about why this adventure was awesome and why it is. I did do a little thing a while back about what were the best sandbox adventures, and you heard like Griffin Mountain and the Kingmaker series and Smuggler's Shiv, and to talk about why those worked and what made them fun and entertaining. But that was a real interesting scenario. Um, so I want to thank everybody for, you know, stopping over on Rite Designs today. Just listening to me ramble on about adventures and why I get excited about them, and uh, what we're working on a bit with Rite Publishing, and how I think about adventure design. And we'll talk a little bit more about adventures. It's one of my favorite subjects. Um, I want to do more, especially for Lords of Gossamer Shadow, and hopefully we'll get some folks on here to talk about adventure design in the future. I'd like to get Mike Wellham on here. I'd like to get Robert Emerson of Adventure Quarterly on here. I'd like to get uh, Kindred on here. I'd like to get some other to talk about the adventures we're doing for Lords of Gossamer Shadow. I like to talk to some adventure designers just in general. So thanks for stopping on Rite Designs today, and I will talk to you folks later. Bye.